Welcome to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. I'm Dr. Kate Balistreri, a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist. But mostly, I'm someone who believes the conversations we avoid are the conversations that can set us free. I founded the practice Modern Intimacy, where my team and I help people make sense of the invisible forces driving their desire, their relationships, and their emotional health. This podcast is for people ready to have a more honest relationship with themselves and everyone else. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's pleasure. So here's your invitation to peel back the layers, to get smarter, to get closer, and to get naked. No pressure, no performance, just the real thing. You've seen the headlines: a classmate, a coworker, an Olympian, a 13-year-old. Someone takes a photo from your social media or just your LinkedIn headshot, and within minutes, they're naked, simulated, shared, sold. Not because of desire, but because someone wants to control you or women. We've been calling this a privacy crisis, a consent violation, a tech policy problem. But today's guest says that that's not just wrong, it's dangerous. She says we need to call deepfakes what they really are: stochastic terrorism, a male supremacist weapon of political oppression designed to silence women, punish noncompliance with patriarchal mandates, and govern public life through sexual threat. Today's guest, Soraya Chemaly, is the author of several books: Rage Becomes Her, The Resilience Myth, and All We Want Is Everything. And she's been tracking online and in-person gender-based behavior and violence since before most of us knew what a deepfake was. In my work as a psychologist and sex therapist, I spend a lot of my days in the wreckage of this kind of violence with folks, with girls who've been expelled for confronting their abusers, with mothers who can't sleep, and with men who genuinely don't see why generating a naked image of a woman without her consent is even a problem. So today, what we're talking about is not reporting tools or hashing out protocols. We're talking about power and punishment, and why the current conversation about deepfakes has failed us, and what might finally work instead. Soraya, welcome.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be here with you, Kate. Thank you.
I wish we were talking about fun things once in a while,
I
and
know.
maybe someday we will. But a few months ago in March, you wrote this incredible Substack that honestly stopped me in my tracks. And it was called, well, let's first give a shout out to your Substack called Unmanned. I really appreciate the writing you're doing in this Substack and really highlighting so many critical aspects of patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, and how they show up in everyday life in ways that people really are not thinking about, even myself. Your blog in March, it was on March 18th for anyone who wants to check it out, was called Call Deepfakes What They Are: Stochastic Terrorism. Understanding the Sexual Deepfakes as Male Supremacist Tool of Political Oppression. Can we break down the concept of stochastic terrorism for folks who may not be familiar with that term?
Stochastic terrorism refers specifically to when influential individuals, in this case, for example, manosphere influencers or the president, uses very incendiary language to demonize a specific group of people that in a way that makes them fair game targets in the
Mm-hmm.
society. And so we see that with racism, we see it with anti-Semitism, but we don't really talk about it so much in terms of gender and intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about what that means, to have that permission structure created by influential people, it becomes more evident how the acts of individual men to enforce the discipline that flows from those ideas are terroristic, right? They're acting in ways that regulate, for example, women in the society using threat and violence that they've essentially been told is virtuous and morally justified by people that they respect.
Absolutely. It's a hallmark of hostile sexism. And I think
Yes.
maybe a lot of folks are not familiar with ambivalent sexism,
Mm,
benevolent sexism, and hostile sexism. So just
yes.
briefly on that, Benevolent sexism is this sort of idea of a benevolent patriarch, a good guy, somebody
Hmm.
who's a bit of a hero. He does the right thing, he has integrity. And women take heed and they take their quote unquote rightful role. They observe that he is the more powerful person in their relationship in society, the protector and the provider. This myth is a beautiful fantasy. People love to dig their teeth into it. But what happens when women don't uphold that fantasy of male protector and provision and heroism at its core,
Hmm.
they are, by the tenets of hostile sexism, it's amenable to punish them. And we see
Right.
that punishment take many shapes and many forms, in significant forms, sexual harassment and sexual degradation. So if we're thinking about deepfakes as the latest iteration of stochastic terrorism, it makes a lot of sense that very influential manosphere type folks who have a podcast, who have a microphone, who have a
Hmm.
large following, would use something that seems so permissible, sort of the agricultural groupthink that is our human species, to punish women, to control them, to dominate them. And so that's the context in which we're seeing this application.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing too about benevolent and ambivalent or hostile sexism is that we also, I think, really need to think about the way that's already racialized before we even get to a
Mm,
situation like deepfakes, right? So, historically, in a country like the United States, white women have disproportionately benefited from the protection of men, particularly white men, but structurally from the protection from men by
mhm.
other men, right, as protectors. That has never really been extended, for example, to Black women in society. The sexism that they experience has always been hostile, and the way that Moira Bailey described that was misogynoir. And we
Mhm.
also see that in the use of technology to discipline women. Some of the earliest attacks on women on the internet were against Black women. Um, and that takes many forms. You have the individual actors who are doing the things you and I are talking about when we talk about AI deep fakes.
Mhm.
But I would include in that what happens, for example, with algorithmic bias and the way it sorts people in imagery, for instance, right? You can look and see the ways systemically the hostility towards women of color and Black women manifests itself in the most sexualized, sexually degrading ways in imagery of women online.
We just saw a really key example of that with Meg the Stallion being targeted after it became clear that her recent partner was,
Hmm.
I think, engaged in some infidelity. And interestingly, the internet became ripe with memes and images that were sexually degrading her. And my opinion is because she had the quote unquote audacity to actually call it out and name it personally, right? She was being punished with that sexual degradation. And to your point, it's an interpersonal experience, but it is also this systemic and technological amplification of misogynoir.
With the thing we haven't talked about with stochastic terrorism, with all terrorism, which I think rape is terroristic in the society, is that all of us change our behavior because of it. All of us are aware of the threat. Even though we may not, as individuals, know when it might happen, we have to be aware that it might happen. There's a pretty reasonable rate that something's going to happen. The way terrorism works is to control people in the society through fear. And that's how women have to navigate rape. And so, in fact, the deep fakes are just yet another contributor to that overall rape culture that we swim in. The thing about Megan Thee Stallion and somebody like Taylor Swift, who has also been represented in those ways, people, I think, don't want to appreciate what it means to take powerful women in the society, rich women who have accumulated influence, women who are highly visible in the public sphere, and degrade them as a message to all other women.
Right.
It doesn't matter how talented you are, how popular you are. how good a person you might be. Whatever it is, it's irrelevant because, in fact, any man anywhere can now use this technology to demean you and to, quote unquote, as many believe, put you in your place.
Absolutely. And this is a great example of shifting our way of thinking about deepfakes from a consent crisis to this idea of terrorism. So, in the blog that you wrote, you argued that framing deepfakes as a consent crisis or a privacy violation really misses the point. And instead, we really do need to see them as a weapon of terrorism. And as a therapist, I work with survivors every single day who blame themselves for not being careful enough with their images. So, how do you think really conceptualizing this as terrorism rather than a personal failing can change the healing process for a woman or a girl who's been targeted?
I mean, a couple of things are really striking to me, and I'm an advocate of consent. I believe in
Hmm.
consent. I don't, what I'm going to say is not, doesn't mean that's not true. But a lot of the issue with the way people conceive of consent is that the responsibility is ultimately the woman's in this dynamic to say what she wants when she wants it, as opposed to there being a societal norm that makes sexual assault and violation unfathomable, right? And so a lot of people will blame themselves, as you said, for maybe having pictures out there. It doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Even if you don't have pictures out there today, AI can make the pictures, right? It's really just irrelevant. But I will say that it's such a prevalent model for our having to keep ourselves safe. And that's really the way the system deals with the problem. So, what I did write about in that piece was an experience that I had in being an escalator of critical cases to Facebook. Many different organizations, a network that I was associated with, had been fighting platforms like Facebook for allowing what was then called revenge porn, which
Hmm.
thank God I think has now been
Image
replaced by
based.
image
Yeah.
based abuse.
Hmm.
But their response to it was to encourage women users to upload their nudes to a database so the company could hash those nudes, meaning code them, and then identify them if someone else posted them. And I just still can't wrap my brain around this because essentially, again, it's treated as a technical issue to be solved in a technical way by turning the women's property, in this case, because it's all about copyright, not about human rights or dignity, into the mechanism of trying to reduce the crime.
Hmm.
But that's really not a solution. That's kind of like putting a band-aid on an amputation. I understand they thought maybe they were doing their best, but it's not good enough. And it's also not consistent. Just that example just will always sit in my, lives rent free in my head.
Understandably, it's another great example of how women continue to be held responsible for the behavior of men, right? Because the action could be regulated and monitored in really different ways, right? There could be so many other safeguards and checks and balances put into place on these different technology platforms,
Mhm.
but that's not the way that the problem is being looked at. And in fact, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was really staggering. It was something above, I think, 65 or 70% of all AI is actually deepfake material.
Right. Well, and 99% is all deep fakes targeting women. I think that's the statistic I think people they're not grappling with.
Or they explain it away as it's part of what is acceptable in this world. That's the point I'm bumping up against with a lot of folks is still this idea that somehow the people involved whose images have been created beyond their
Hmm.
consent, outside of their consent, that somehow they deserved it or earned it or it's the rightful thing because of their choice to be in public life or their choice to be
Right.
a person in the world with a body, right?
And also that this is just something men do.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just something that, not me, but other men do.
Right.
You
Not
know,
me.
uh, Not me, but other
Yeah.
men do it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think what was also striking to me when I was writing that was I'd been looking at news headlines from January when all the deepfake
Hmm.
proliferation started happening on X, from January through when I wrote it. And the vast majority of articles across media So whether it was the New York Times or Wired or The Guardian, didn't matter, really focused again on the technical or the legal. And those will never solve this problem, ever.
Mm-mm.
They just were not oriented towards understanding the problem as systematic, institutionalized, tech facilitated gender based violence perpetrated by men against women. And there's just no doubt that that's what it is.
It's so clear that this is an attempt to control and dominate and maintain a level of rigor in a position of power systemically and across the globe. It's a clear message. It's a clear message to women that if you don't do as we say, we will do as we want. Yeah, which ultimately means we will do what we want no matter what.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and that makes me laugh because I just remember among the many things that Trump has said is that we're going to protect women whether they want us to or not.
Yeah.
I just can't, you know,
The irony.
you can't make it up. But yeah, I mean, I think that what's difficult is, which is actually what I try to do when I write, is to break down how it is this can be acceptable in any way
Hmm.
and connect it to people's day-to-day lives, to the gender identities, gender roles, gender norms, racial norms, racial identities that we take for granted in our society or that we are reluctant to interrogate or that we're actually currently doubling down on, right? And so it it it's just this sort of gradual slide from early childhood into the creation of a culture where this can be happening every day and where nothing serious is done earlier on in the process to try and reduce its likelihood.
Just sitting with what you've said, it feels like the first time I've really thought about just that arc of transition from early childhood into adulthood, where there really is no expectation of things changing. And in fact, the more you see and the more you understand what's happening, the more you can recognize it,
Hmm.
and just how dire that can feel for so many women.
Right.
You've probably seen this content going around once in a while on social media. Someone will ask a question to women: when was the first time you remember experiencing sexual harassment from adult
Hmm.
men? And I'm always not shocked because I've worked with folks who have been survivors of sexual violence and perpetrators of sexual violence for years. But it does always strike me as so, first of all, important, and second of all, brave for the women to talk about that their earliest memories are as children, young children.
Well, how old were you?
I was 3 the first
Yeah.
time I remember that. How about
Hmm.
you?
When I was 9, I was openly threatened with rape by a boy in a schoolyard. Even before that, just walking down the street was like an obstacle course always.
Mm,
And I walked down the street a lot where I grew up, like down main streets, you know. But if you were to extend that, for example, into family life, I just have early memories of knowing which men to avoid. You know, that just indicated that I had a sense that they were not safe and that they were somehow predatory.
I remember 2 friends of the family making really inappropriate comments to me, and they weren't overtly violent or
Mm-hmm.
hostile, but they were clearly sexualized. And as I've gotten older, I think a lot about the ways that we misinterpret sexualized language as about
Mm-hmm.
arousal, when
Mm-hmm.
really it's about power and
That's
dominance
right.
in these contexts.
And I think it's about establishing a pattern of behavior. I think a lot
Yes.
about a cousin I had, a young boy. He didn't want to be touched. He didn't want to be kissed or hugged or a very touchy-feely family, mine. Lots of hugging and kissing at all times.
Hmm.
Um, and no one respected him.
Wow.
Everybody just said, of course, we're going to do this. And I think that's pretty typical in a lot of families where it's just considered what you do out of love. But what it does is what we know it does, which is to not allow a person to establish their own boundaries and to then respect those boundaries, you know, and I think that's just the norm more still than the exception.
I agree with you 100%. And I would say it's about love, I think, in an outward facing way, but it's often unconsciously about establishing and reestablishing a culture of hierarchical respect in
100%.
families, right?
100%. Right.
Don't say no to grandma or uncle so
Mm,
and so when they ask for a hug. You respect them and you give them a
right.
hug. So it's that kind of conditioning in our families
Right.
where the political becomes familial and
Mm-hmm.
relational, and we get conditioned and socialized to obey and to
Right.
respect. And that training, if you will, around
Yes.
dominance and submission becomes very, I'll say, useful from a predatory and
Yes.
power reestablishing function. But certainly, yeah, it denigrates people's bodily sovereignty, their
Mm-hmm.
understanding of where their yes and their no actually can begin.
Right. Or that they even have the right to say yes or
Right,
no, right?
right.
Early on, maybe sometime last year, I wrote a post about Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny book, which I
Mm,
like.
hmm.
But what I basically said was that stops at the front door. So it just doesn't go far enough. If you are a child, if you are a woman, if you are queer, if you don't know and you're struggling for some reason in your own home, or you are living in an abusive home, the tyranny that you face, and in fact, my argument was the tyranny of the larger culture starts in those houses and starts in those families, which is what you just described. And so, if you can think about confronting tyranny as an intimate, personal, and interpersonal issue, then you can expand the types of things he said to create more democratic family life.
One of the pushbacks that I often get when I'm talking about that with folks, whether we're working on helping them heal their trauma or we're talking more on sort of the bigger socio-political position that
Mm.
they feel themselves to be in the world, the pushback that I get is, but we have to respect authority. And
Yes.
I'm curious how you I know how I navigate that clinically with folks, but how do you navigate that as you're talking about the bigger socio-political context?
What's a good way to put this? Why do you have to respect authority is the question to me. Just why? I've never, even as a child, I'm like, why should I respect authority? I'm not sure what is happening here, right? And I
Right.
think some of us, even as children, have that, and probably that has a lot to do with our parenting. Like, I think a lot about that question of respecting authority, again, in the context of families, where you have authoritarian parenting. That's what it's called,
Hmm.
conservative religious families in particular, whether they're Catholic, Jewish, evangelical, doesn't matter. It's the same parenting style. And it is
Right.
very much do what I say. Do not question what I say, which is a terrible model for growing citizens, right? It's like the
Horrible.
worst.
Yeah.
And then you have totally permissive parents who kind of check out, which is also not useful because little children actually need to have guardrails. And then you have authoritative, which is I have more power than you do, and I'm responsible for you. And maybe I'll do some more explaining and we can talk about how we reach consensus. And that's the middle ground, right?
Right. And tends to have the best outcomes in terms of well-adjusted adults.
Adults who question authority. It's
Right.
not just a given. You don't just do what you're told. I just happened to watch this again this weekend because I just can't get over it. The young men who use ChatGPT to defund DEI across government agencies. Basically, their answer to many questions was, well, we were told to do X, we were told to do Y, so we did it. And I'm like, okay,
And this is how that authoritarian conditioning creates an intergenerational arc from child to adult, from victim to perpetrator, from powerless to powerful.
yes,
Right. And when we have a lot of folks who have been raised that way, and it's not been accessible or safe or even interesting, maybe for them to do their own healing work, we see the long-standing implications that this kind of parenting style and way of creating a society can ultimately keep people terrified and in a position of it's going to be you or me, right?
right,
And
very cutthroat.
Exactly. And when your options are so limited and so dichotomous, I'm either the victim or the victor, that's a scary place to be. And it doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room for you to be anything other than weak or strong.
Right, that's right. We talk a lot, I think, in sort of gender parenting
Hmm.
society about the way femininity encourages people to concede.
Hmm.
There's a lot of talk about that. I think that men fight back more, that men are more independent and contrarian, which I personally think is bullshit. But
Yeah, I
yeah, I
disagree with that as well.
yeah, I disagree with that, but I also think what we should be talking about is in fact the way masculinity demands conformity in hierarchy from men.
Yes.
Boys and men are socialized within hierarchy to compete, but also to obey. And that is not the way femininity works generally. It's not, in the separate sphere, sex segregated culture that we live in, women are actually freer and have denser relational networks, are not as hierarchical in their separate sphere. Men do not have access to that. And so they are much more prey, again, to the charismatic, to the authoritarian. And we see that in our politics.
We absolutely do see it in our politics, and we see it in the way that young men are being radicalized and galvanized through their
Mm,
vulnerabilities by
right.
these very larger than life manosphere personalities.
Mhm.
And they're preying on the tender spots that these young boys and young men have because of that rigidity. Those young men are being manipulated and told, oh, it's women who are taking these things away from you. Women are the
Mhm.
problem. Women are the reason you're not happy because they have XYZ benefits in
Mhm.
contrast to men. But what they're really avoiding talking about is exactly what you just said, the way that young men become so vulnerable because of
Mhm.
the rigidity of gender role socialization. It's really developmentally, emotionally, and relationally limiting when you cannot fully express into your true whole humanity.
When your whole humanity, because part of it is considered feminine, becomes shameful, right? Those parts of you that might liberate you are sources of shame and punishment, because there is active punishment of boys who do not
Absolutely.
conform, right? Like starting very young.
Hmm.
Um, but that's why I strive in explaining male supremacy, which is what the book I released in November is
Hmm.
about, to
Hmm.
explain that male supremacy, even though non-cis, non-hetero, and feminine people are oppressed by male supremacy, its operating function and feature is competition between men within hierarchy.
Yes. Hmm.
So men will use women or will punish gay men or, will enforce racism and xenophobia in competitions with other men ultimately.
Hmm.
And I think that's really important to stress because until we confront that, we really can't deal with the downstream effects of it.
I really appreciate the way you so succinctly named that. It's a culture of domination and
Hmm.
Lord of the Flies at its
Yes.
simplest terms. And so, what ends up happening is everyone who is a non heterosexual cisgender man becomes an object for the displacement of that hierarchical subjugation in the
Hmm.
competition of other men,
Right.
between men. It's the only trickle down that's really been effective.
When I see young men turning to right wing
Hmm.
cultures and information and defense, they feel it as self defense, right?
They do.
There's all the cognitive dissonance of saying, I
Hmm.
don't feel safe, I'm anxious, I'm economically anxious, I'm academically not doing well, and simultaneously being told, but you have privilege in the society,
Right.
right? Those two things never can connect, even though those two things are both true at the same time.
Hmm.
As individuals, men may not feel it, but over their lifetimes, they will benefit from that. But that's got to be hard. That's just incredibly dissonant. And um, turning to environments that extend dignity instead of shame
Hmm.
is just sensible if you're in that situation.
Absolutely. I work with men all the time who are coming in, not necessarily naming this juxtaposition, but it's
Hmm.
showing up in how they understand themselves and they're interpreting themselves to be failures
Mm-hmm.
because they're saying, well, I'm supposed to have all this privilege. I hear all the time that I'm someone who should be successful or I should have all of
Mm-hmm.
these things because my life hasn't been hard. And that's not really what privilege means.
Right.
Um, but it really does create a fragmentation for a lot of men because
Mm-hmm.
when they do hear, as is rightfully the story, we should be talking about privilege and the way different groups have more or less of it, but they really do hear it as a personal failing, and they're
Yes.
not understanding the way systemically they're actually not supposed to have the success that they're told they're supposed to have because
Right.
that's only relegated to a few really high
Right. At the
status men at
top
the
of the
top.
hierarchy.
Right.
Right. And, this is what's interesting to me about the boy crisis in
Mm-hmm.
education. The boy crisis is a rhetorical sleight of hand that has been used cyclically for 150 years. Every time there's a situation in which, for example, women might threaten some form of institutional dominance, the boy crisis resurfaces with a
Mm-hmm.
different face. So it has been the fact that, you know, feminization hurts boys morally, that it hurts them physically, that it hurts them psychologically, that it's hurting them economically. All like just go down every 20 years, there's another sort of variant of that. But what's so striking to me about it is that there's no kind of recognition that through it all, the overall system has never really changed. Even though women have been outperforming men for 100 years in school, it hasn't translated into either political power, economic parity, closing wage and wealth gaps, epistemic authority in our intellectual environments. There's a total disconnect. And yet that seems to be irrelevant to proponents. The only thing that becomes legible is girls get better grades, girls go to college more. And it's just the one area where men no longer have absolute dominance by default.
What do you think that's about? The fact that girls are getting better grades and that this is the one area where they have been outperforming men very consistently.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that basically you have several things going on at once. One is gender gaps are not universal. The United States is an outlier in peer countries. Like Germany has no educational gender gap. If this
Mm,
were a matter of biology, that would not be true. So let's just
exactly.
leave that out there. But
Hmm.
the second thing is fixating on gender basically benefits the people who already have privilege and are not suffering from a gender gap. So that is wealthier middle and upper middle class white and Asian boys who are already redshirted and for whom that gender gap almost doesn't exist. Because the gap is tied to socioeconomics, it's mainly Black and Hispanic families and communities that are experiencing it in bigger and bigger numbers. So the more dire our socioeconomic problems become, the bigger wealth inequality becomes, the worse the gender gap. So that's the problem, right? But regardless of what that has happened, how that happens within schools, I think what we're seeing is not a problem intrinsic to males, but
Hmm.
to role incongruity.
Hmm.
So the fact is that boys and men now perceive education to be a feminized space because we've told them
Right.
it is, and
Hmm.
because women are there in large numbers. And that feminization then makes them balk because learning itself becomes antithetical to being a man, and
Right.
then they ditch education. And if they're within education, they ditch humanities because STEM offers them a closed male fraternal space where they don't have to compete directly with women because losing to women is stigmatizing. You can lose to a man and it's all okay. Everybody understands that might happen. But if you're a boy and you lose to a woman, are you ever going to be a real man? Probably no, in that framework,
Mm,
right? And
right.
so I think that women have been doing what they've always done, which is chug along in academia, try and do
Hmm.
well, because they need more education and higher degrees to do things like close the wage gap and wealth gaps, right? I mean, if you're a woman and you're in middle class, you still need to have a graduate degree to make what your brother will make with an undergraduate degree. You need a college degree to make what your brother will make with a high school degree. And so it makes sense for women to do that. It makes more sense for men not to do it because if you're, for example, a working class man, you can go into the trades. You can make a decent income on plumbing, and maybe that's the better solution, right? Maybe everybody shouldn't be going to college. Maybe like other countries have all kinds of ways that they've dealt with this that we haven't yet. It's complicated, but I also think, again, in this case, we're not paying attention to those two things, the role incongruity and the male flight.
There is often this double bind that men find themselves in completely unconsciously. This isn't necessarily
Hmm.
something that men are walking around really understanding or
Right,
intentionally sitting in, right?
right.
But there is this double bind between I want to have XYZ human experience, but that's in conflict with how I want to be perceived as a man.
Right,
And
right.
so they're often having to choose between adherence to their identities as men or
Hmm.
masculinity and living in the support of that construct for fear that if
Hmm.
they don't, they might get ostracized, they might
Right.
get
It will be
hurt,
withdrawn.
it will be withdrawn, right?
Hmm.
But then also, they have to hold back from these other really meaningful parts of their
Yes.
experience as humans, as men, as lovers, as friends, as
Emotional
parents.
life.
Yes,
Like
it is so painful to watch them struggle with how to have both and to be afraid in both directions.
it really cuts them off from having these human experiences.
I see them all the time really struggling with how to step into a relational space,
Hmm.
mostly with their partners, given the work that I
Hmm.
do. They want to show up for their partner. They want to feel more connected. They want to have a deeper relational experience, a deeper sexual experience. But to do that would require vulnerability. It would require them doing something that maybe doesn't align with these rigid mandates of their understanding of masculinity. And so I do really feel that tension for them a lot, and it's painful.
It's painful and it's sad
It
to
is.
me,
Mhm.
because I think what happens in childhood is, I mean, we do this with girls too, maybe a lesser degree when it comes to emotions, but we really do strip boys of their full range of human
Yes.
experiences and emotions. And that's what the man box is all about. And we know, for example, that the man box is even more rigid and more depended on by men who suffer feminization in other ways, for example, through xenophobia or racism, right? A
Mm.
black man is feminized by racism all the time, and so he might double down in terms of his relationship with a woman on the kinds of rigid masculine performances to compensate.
On that stage, he always has a one-up advantage.
Right.
Yeah. We started this conversation talking about deep fakes as a form of terrorism, stochastic terrorism, and I want to just
Hmm.
really bring this back
Hmm.
to the impact. You described in your blog about this how women become forced to recalibrate their public existence. So they have to
Hmm.
manage photos, their speech, their visibility in
Hmm.
anticipation of deepfake abuse. And
Hmm.
again, I see this as a recipe for hypervigilance, complex
Yes.
trauma, chronic shame, sexual inhibition. So,
Hmm.
how might we encourage women to distinguish between healthy boundary setting and sort of the pathological internalization of threat? And where does resilience go to die when threat is truly unstoppable?
That's so interesting. A couple of things. One is, um, I'm almost relieved that this is happening now at this scale
Mm. Hmm.
because so many of us have worked for so long to talk about what these dynamics look like and frankly have been ignored. And the fact
Hmm.
is that with this technology, no one, no one, not boys, not men, no one is safe from this
Hmm.
technology. And so that pervasiveness, that ubiquity kind of frees everyone. The second thing is, even if you police yourself, it's irrelevant. You could do your best and it wouldn't matter because anyone acting with malice can now just make a fake version of you, right? And
Right.
in a weird, perverse way, that makes everything less powerful,
Mm. Oh, I really
you
like how
know?
you turn that upside down. Yeah, that
It
makes a
makes
lot of
everything
sense.
less
Hmm.
powerful. And then the third thing is, I will say that what feminism and critical thinking can provide for people, but particularly for young girls and women, is a solid way to armor yourself against the shame that others
Mhm.
want to impose on you through sexualization. There is no shame in your sexuality, in your desire for sex. That's separate and apart from whether other people want to use sexualization as a weapon. And a lot of media doesn't make the distinction between sexuality and sexualization, but anyone can,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that understanding that, and this is hard, I'm not saying it's easy because it's hard to see these images and it's hard to think this is how people might be thinking of me.
Mhm.
But if you have a solid sense of your own self that's not as reliant on what other people think of you, then you will be better off in that environment because you really have no control over any of it.
I really appreciate your framing of that. And especially in understanding that one of the biggest psychological benefits of feminism is understanding yourself as equal and fully human, regardless
Hmm.
of how other people are intent on seeing and understanding you.
Right? And be able to separate yourself. And I think that's hard because our culture also has been just generating perfectionism. I think it's particularly bad in my lifetime. I don't know that maybe I didn't have the language as a younger person, but perfectionism is such a prevailing societal problem, which again makes people vulnerable to attacks like this. And I just urge people to think about that difference that we just discussed. You have no control over it. You're not responsible for other people's actions. It has nothing to do with you, your sexuality.
I'm so glad you brought in perfectionism because perfectionism is a psychological defense to shame, right? We often
Hmm.
believe that if I can just be perfect, then I
Yes.
won't have to feel unworthy or like I'm not good enough or that I'm
Hmm.
embarrassing in some way. So, of course, it makes a lot of sense that folks would strive for
Yes.
perfectionism as a way to avoid the devastating effects of shame, which
Hmm.
look, we live in a culture where we are shamed for everything,
Yes.
especially women for being sexual beings
That's right.
and or for having the desire to be sovereign, to be independent, to want to take up
Hmm.
space in the world. It's not just sexuality that becomes a catalyst for the kind of punishment, shaming, and devaluation that deepfakes
Hmm.
provide. It's an attempt to shame women for wanting to be full and whole and big in the world and
And big
alive.
in the world. Right. You mentioned this and we skipped over it, but that is separate from, I think, the fear. Because the
Mhm.
other point of the terrorism is fear. It is
Right.
literally to make women fearful. And women are already fearful. Even women who don't admit it, they're already shaping their lives unconsciously around avoiding risk of male perpetrated sexualized violence. But in this case, it's such an explicit threat. You should fear me. I will do this to you. I can do this to you. Anyone can do it to you at any time. I do think that there is a legitimate conversation that we have to have about vicarious trauma, about secondary trauma, about insidious trauma, about all of the hypervigilance that can stem from that, because that is
Mhm.
the weapon that is being used.
Right. It does have deep impacts on our collective experience
Right.
of being women in the world. And it can create so much fear in the body and so much inhibition around fully expressing oneself sexually. Because
Right.
what does it mean if I actually step into this?
Hmm.
Right? If this thing has happened to me, if someone's created an image of me sexually without my
Hmm.
consent, what does it mean if I actually enjoy being sexual? Am I giving them tacit permission?
Right.
Does it mean that
Or
I'm
will I be
somehow
blamed
agreeing with
for
them?
giving them tacit permission? Yeah. Street harassment does the same thing.
Hmm.
And this has the same qualities. It shares qualities with street harassment, but its amplification is different. Its longevity is different. Its pervasiveness is different. I think
Hmm.
qualitatively those do make a big difference. And we should
Yeah.
pay attention to that. It's not a straight comparison. It's relevant, but I think this is definitely different.
With deepfakes and AI technology, the reach is so expansive.
Yeah.
What if we were going to compare catcalling on the street. That
Mm.
is painful and it's fearful and it
Yeah,
can be frustrating and all the things, but it doesn't get witnessed by millions and millions of people and amplified
right.
by millions of people. And then the secondary victimization of all the comments under
Hmm.
clips of that nature,
Right.
blaming, victim blaming, shaming
And it
her
never
even
goes
more.
away.
It never goes
And
away.
you
Yeah.
cannot walk away from it. Like women will
Right.
alter their commutes, they'll avoid certain places.
Hmm.
It gives them some measure, I think, of control and agency. And and the control at a distance that is affected by digital technology is simply an escalation. It's a real intensification.
This conversation has been so illuminating. Thank you so
No,
much.
thank you. It was lovely to talk to you, even about difficult things.
Always. It's lovely to speak with you too, even about the hard things. Your new book, All We Want Is Everything: How We Dismantle Male Supremacy. The link is in our notes. Where else can folks reach you, find you, if they want to follow your work and hear more about your perspective?
I'm on Instagram under my name, but also an account called Rage Becomes Her, which was my first book. And I write in Substack. The Substack's called Unmanned. I have an account in X that I haven't used since it was purchased by Elon Musk. Um, and so I'm on Blue Sky, and I think those are the main places.
Amazing. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. That's our time today. Thank you for joining me and for showing up for yourself. Before we go, a gentle reminder: this podcast is for education and exploration. It's not a substitute for clinical care. If you're ready for more personalized support, my team and I at Modern Intimacy offer free consultations to help you figure out what that could look like. You can go to modernintimacy.com or find the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep getting smarter, getting closer, and getting naked in all the ways that matter to you.